Diplomatic protocols and instruments. Discernible pattern. There is indeed a discernible pattern across all regions of the world in terms of how diplomatic protocols, collective security frameworks, and diplomatic instruments are structured and implemented, though this pattern varies based on historical, cultural, economic, and geopolitical factors specific to each region. While some common themes emerge, the specifics of implementation and approach differ significantly from one region to another. Below are some of the key patterns that can be observed across different regions. 1. Importance of multilateralism in collective security. Across all regions, there is a noticeable emphasis on multilateral frameworks for security, particularly in regions with shared security concerns or where smaller states benefit from collective defense arrangements. Global approach. Multilateral organizations like the United Nations, UN, are seen as crucial for maintaining global peace and security. The UN Security Council has a role in nearly every region, from peacekeeping missions in Africa, for example, Sudan and the DRC, to diplomatic negotiations in Asia and the Middle East, for example, the Iran nuclear deal. Regional organizations. Across regions, regional organizations have played vital roles in promoting collective security. For example, NATO in Europe and North America, the African Union, AU, in Africa, ASEAN in Southeast Asia, and ECOWAS in West Africa have emerged as key actors in conflict resolution, peacekeeping, and the promotion of regional security. Pattern. The global trend of fostering multilateral cooperation to handle security concerns is mirrored at the regional level. This suggests that countries tend to prefer mechanisms that provide collective security, as it reduces the burden of defense on individual nations and increases the chances of deterrence against external threats. 2. Bilateral security pacts. Reflecting geopolitical and strategic interests in addition to multilateral agreements, bilateral security agreements are also prominent, and they tend to be motivated by strategic, geopolitical, and historical interests. Nations align with others that share common security concerns or military capabilities, further cementing geopolitical ties. U.S.-centric alliances. The United States has established bilateral security agreements with numerous countries worldwide, including Japan, South Korea, Israel, and Australia. These pacts are often shaped by U.S. foreign policy priorities and reflect the central role of the U.S. in the global security framework. Regional powers and neighboring states. Countries with significant regional influence often seek bilateral arrangements with neighboring states to bolster their security while securing strategic advantages. India and Russia's security relationship, South Korea and the United States, and Israel and the United States are examples of these bilateral partnerships, focusing on defense cooperation and mutual deterrence against shared threats. Pattern. The strategic interests of nations, particularly in regions with heightened threats or historical conflicts, push countries into bilateral agreements. The mutual reliance on powerful states, such as the US, or the shared interest in specific regional conflicts forms a key part of the global diplomatic pattern. 3. Cultural and historical context in diplomatic protocols. While diplomatic protocols are universal in their core principles, cultural and historical factors significantly shape the implementation of these protocols. Countries within certain regions maintain distinct diplomatic traditions and practices that stem from their history and culture. Western diplomacy. In Europe and North America, diplomacy is often highly formalized, with clear structures of hierarchy and precedence, particularly in formal settings such as state visits or treaty signings. The use of ceremonial practices, including the treatment of diplomats, is aligned with long-standing traditions dating back to the 17th and 18th centuries. Asia's diplomatic practices. Asian countries, particularly in East Asia, tend to be more reserved in diplomatic interactions, often prioritizing harmony, mutual respect, and indirect communication in negotiations. China and Japan, for example, employ diplomatic practices that reflect their unique cultural emphasis on hierarchy, respect, and consensus building. Diplomatic relations in Asia are often intertwined with trade, and there is an increasing focus on economic diplomacy, as seen in China's Belt and Road Initiative. Africa's evolving diplomacy. In Africa, diplomacy is influenced by both the legacies of colonialism and the push for regional unity. The rise of the African Union, AU, has fostered a collective approach to diplomacy, but individual states also maintain specific diplomatic traditions that reflect their histories, such as post-colonial struggles for independence and the need to assert sovereignty. Many African nations also emphasize solidarity in diplomatic relations due to common experiences of colonial oppression and economic underdevelopment. Pattern. Diplomatic protocols in each region are tailored to cultural expectations and historical experiences. However, in each case, there is an increasing focus on economic diplomacy as a driver for engagement, with countries seeking not only political ties but also economic partnerships that can bring mutual benefits. 4. Economic diplomacy as a growing theme across all regions. There is a growing emphasis on economic diplomacy, where nations seek diplomatic tools not just for political or security purposes but increasingly for boosting trade, investments, and economic cooperation. Asia. China's Belt and Road Initiative and Japan's economic diplomacy focus heavily on infrastructure development and trade agreements to secure long-term economic ties with numerous countries across Asia, Africa, and Europe. Latin America. In Latin America, trade blocs such as Mercosur and ALBA are central to diplomatic relations. Economic cooperation through trade agreements has become as important as traditional security diplomacy. For example, Mexico increasingly prioritizes economic diplomacy, especially in the context of US-Mexico trade relations. Pattern. Economic concerns are at the forefront of international relations everywhere, and economic diplomacy is seen as a primary tool for achieving national goals, whether for boosting domestic economies, securing energy resources, or expanding global markets. 5. Security concerns shaping regional alliances across all regions. Security concerns, whether arising from territorial disputes, threats of terrorism, or geopolitical tensions, shape the diplomatic and collective security landscape. Nations often align themselves within alliances that respond to specific security concerns relevant to their region. Middle East and Asia. In the Middle East, the shifting balance of power, with countries like Iran, Saudi Arabia, and Israel, has driven a number of bilateral alliances based on perceived threats and strategic imperatives. For example, Israel's partnership with the US is tied to mutual concerns about Iran's nuclear ambitions and regional security. Africa. In Africa, states often form regional security alliances to manage internal instability and cross-border threats. The creation of ECOS, Economic Community of West African States, peacekeeping missions is an example of this regional approach, where members collectively address regional crises, such as in Liberia and Sierra Leone. Pattern. Regional security threats and conflicts frequently determine diplomatic alignments. Nations seek diplomatic and military partners who can provide support in managing regional instability or preventing further escalation, often relying on both bilateral and multilateral frameworks to mitigate these threats. Conclusion. A global diplomatic pattern. While each region has distinct diplomatic tools and collective security structures, the common themes of multilateralism, strategic bilateral partnerships, and the growing importance of economic diplomacy are evident across all parts of the world. Whether through organizations like NATO in Europe or the AU in Africa, or through bilateral agreements with major powers like the US, the trend towards collaboration and collective security is clear. Cultural and historical nuances shape diplomatic protocols in each region, but the overarching global pattern emphasizes multilateral cooperation, shared economic interests, and the need for security alliances to tackle common challenges. In an increasingly interconnected world, the ability of nations to work together through multilateral diplomacy, while also leveraging strategic bilateral ties, will continue to play a central role in shaping international relations. Below is a summary of the key patterns observed across regions in diplomatic protocols, collective security frameworks, and diplomatic tools/instruments. I've broken it down into a clear format with bullet points, along with some visual representation to provide a clearer overview. Key patterns across regions in international diplomacy. 1. Emphasis on multilateralism. Global. Central role of the United Nations, UN, for peace and security, with the UN Security Council playing a vital role in conflict resolution. Europe and North America, predominantly through NATO, emphasizing collective defense and regional stability. Africa, the African Union, AU, and ECOWAS focus on regional peacekeeping and conflict resolution. Asia, ASEAN and the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, SCO, promote security cooperation, with China and India leading in their respective regions. Latin America, OISH, Organization of American States, emphasizes diplomatic solutions, while also focusing on regional security without direct military involvement. Pattern, a preference for multilateral security arrangements through regional organizations to address common security concerns. 2. Bilateral security agreements. United States, frequent bilateral alliances, for example, with Japan, South Korea, Israel, for strategic military cooperation. Russia, strong bilateral ties with countries like India and Syria to counter NATO influence. China, Bilateral defense pacts with countries in Asia and Africa, focusing on economic and military cooperation, for example, Pakistan, Russia. Europe, smaller nations often align with NATO powers or form bilateral defense pacts for regional security. Middle East, Israel and Saudi Arabia have bilateral defense agreements with the US to address regional security concerns, for example, Iran. Pattern: bilateral security pacts are driven by strategic, geopolitical, or military concerns, often to counter perceived threats from neighboring states or larger powers. 3. Economic diplomacy. China, focus on trade-based diplomacy, using the Belt and Road Initiative to strengthen economic ties and expand its influence. India, promotes economic cooperation through partnerships like the BRICS and bilateral trade agreements with major powers. US, emphasizes economic diplomacy alongside military alliances, leveraging trade agreements and sanctions to influence global behavior. Latin America, Mercosur promotes economic integration, while Mexico focuses on NAFTA/US-EMCA for trade with the US and Canada. Africa, Africa's trade agreements, for example, AfCFTA, are a growing tool for economic diplomacy, balancing trade and regional development. Pattern: economic diplomacy is a growing focus across all regions, where states use trade and economic cooperation as tools for national influence and regional partnerships. 4. Diplomatic protocols, cultural and historical influence. Europe/North America, highly formalized diplomatic rituals and protocols, with clear ranks and ceremonial practices rooted in history. Asia, strong emphasis on respect, hierarchy, and consensus building, with countries like Japan and China having distinct diplomatic customs that prioritize non-confrontational dialogue. Africa, diplomatic protocols are influenced by post-colonial history, with an emphasis on solidarity and regional cooperation through organizations like the AU. Middle East, diplomatic interactions are often influenced by tribal and religious considerations, and diplomacy is seen as a tool to balance power and influence, often in the context of oil and energy security. Latin America, more flexible diplomatic protocols that focus on solidarity, mutual respect, and regional unity, for example, through ALBA or Mercosur. Pattern: diplomatic protocols are deeply shaped by each region's history, culture, and political context, influencing formality, process, and priorities in diplomatic engagement. 5. Security concerns and alliances. Middle East, security concerns over Iran's nuclear ambitions, terrorism, and regional instability drive alliances, for example, US-Israel, Gulf states alliances. Asia, North Korea's provocations and China's rise shape security alliances like US-South Korea and US-Japan, while countries like India and China engage in regional defense initiatives. Europe, Russian aggression, for example, Ukraine conflict, has led to NATO's expansion and greater collective defense efforts. Africa, regional conflicts, for example, in South Sudan, Mali, lead to multilateral responses from the African Union, AU, and ECOWAS. Latin America, focus on non-military security concerns, with diplomacy centered on drug trafficking, economic stability, and peaceful dispute resolution. Pattern: regional security concerns, for example, terrorism, nuclear threats, territorial disputes, shape diplomatic alliances, often leading to multilateral cooperation and a reliance on collective defense frameworks. Visual representation: patterns in international diplomacy. Here's a simplified figure summarizing the key patterns in international diplomacy across different regions. Conclusion: in summary, there are clear patterns in diplomatic practice and collective security arrangements across all regions of the world. Multilateral security frameworks, such as NATO, the UN, or regional organizations like ASEAN, are universally important in providing stability and cooperation. Bilateral alliances, often driven by strategic interests or historical relationships, are also crucial in shaping security dynamics. Economic diplomacy is an increasing focus globally, and diplomatic protocols are adapted to each region's cultural and historical context. Security concerns, such as territorial disputes, terrorism, and geopolitical rivalries, consistently influence alliances and diplomatic engagements in every region. These patterns highlight the diversity of international diplomacy while also demonstrating common themes in how countries interact, negotiate, and form alliances in an increasingly interconnected world.